So, dear all, we are pleased to present you the first episode of our podcast about ESD, trying to share all our tips and tricks. And today, the main topic will be injection for ESD. We will see that many tricks are existing for injecting. Some of them can be used also for EMR, but mainly here we will discuss about the strategy for ESD and therefore all the tricks that helps your ESD to be safer, faster, more effective, and therefore more attractive. So first, the theory. It is important to precise that injection should be submucosal, not under the muscle, not in the mucosa, but in the submucosal layer. We will see it. Second point, it should be anticipated by an endoscopist, architect, able to predict what will help his resection by doing the good injection. And last, is adapted to the strategy you will use and what you have chosen to do. It means that you have to have a strategy to predict what will be the best strategy for your resection and use the injection to help this strategy to be as much effective as possible. And practically, we will see the devices, the injection fluids, and some examples of injection. So first, we will discuss about the main and the most important thing. It is that the injection should be submucosal. It means that you will fill in the submucosal layer to make a mucosal cushion, to stretch the mucosa and make it more thinner. But to do this, you should avoid transmural injection under the muscle, because sometimes when the bowel is not free, you will have a kind of elevation of your area by injecting through the muscle, for example, in the serosal space. And you should also avoid intramucosal injection because it makes hematomas, some bubbles of blood that will change the color, but also you will have a kind of bleeding with some spots that makes the area more difficult to see, more difficult to cut. So please avoid this too shallow injection. I show you here two different examples. Here, the same hematoma that was done during the injection because the injection was too shallow, but this hematoma is still present after the end of the resection on the specimen itself. When you have this kind of hematoma, you should inject again outside the hematoma, trying to good this to find a good layer and have this blue large elevation and not this small mountain with a kind of purple color, which is an hematoma. So to show it, now we are doing the ESD, we inject, but as you can see, there is the hematoma on the right and the good elevation on the left. We will inject again, trying to have the good layer, and here it is a good elevation, very large, but after, your hematoma will continue to release the blood that was capped into. And if you want to avoid any problem, you can do your incision around the hematoma, or if you have no choice, sometimes go across the hematoma to open it and try to make it empty to avoid this spotting of blood every time during your procedure. It can take long minutes before the end of this blood small flow coming from the hematoma. Second thing, if you inject with high pressure by the assistant, asking him to inject strongly, you will have a thinner mucosa and it will make your incision more effective. I will try to show you it on videos. It is an esophagus on the left, we will inject without pressure. I mean, I ask the nurse to inject, but slowly. You can see that the elevation is good, but not very strong, and the mucosa is not very thin because no pressure under. But if you inject strongly, here you can see a small bubble of air, which is not a good thing, but after I ask her to inject very strongly, and here the mucosa becomes very thin, very easy to cut. And you will see on the left, the incision is not very deep. There is still muscularis mucosa in the incision. But on the right, by doing this, because the mucosa is very stretched by the injection, you can see that your first incision is deeper and easier to do with a good trimming immediately. Also on the left, the mucosa is still thick and more difficult to cut. So please think that where you want to cut, you should have the more pressure you can get under the lesion in order to have the mucosa as thin as possible to be crossed by your knife by doing the incision relatively deep. That makes you able to do both the cutting and the trimming at the same time, doing a larger space in order to begin your ESD case. Next thing, you should inject in the submucosa, and therefore, if you can find the good layer, after you should re-inject in the blue because it's easier. So you will do a first mountain, then inject in the side of the mountain in order to create a second mountain, and after a third mountain, etc. If you inject in an area without any injection before, it will be more difficult to reach the good layer every time. If you enlarge your injection from areas which are already injected, you will save time and do less hematomas. This is an example. So first injection in the cecum, so it is yellow because of the fatty tissue under. But once we get it, we will inject again, coming into the blue, not in the whitish area, inject and enlarge proximally from blue to blue the area which is injected, because it's very easy to get the good area, the good cushion, because it's very large thanks to your previous injection. So it is more effective to enlarge an area which is already injected. It's better than trying every time to re-inject in an area which is not injected. You will have a more homogeneous and a more clear elevation without hematoma. And you can do the same with the knife itself. When you reach the edge of your area which is injected, you can inject again from blue to blue with the tip of the knife. You do just a small hole and then inject again. Do your incision, doing a round shape incision. We will discuss of it in the second episode about incision. And then enlarge your area, but always in the blue areas. I mean, you re-inject an area which has already been injected, not trying to inject from the beginning an area which has not been injected again. So for me, it is the best way to have an homogeneous injection to enlarge in the edges of your blue elevation. And here, for example, injection will be very important to open the space because it is closed in the fold. And when you will inject, it will turn the lesion to see it better. So once again, you see the blue, go to the edge of the blue, inject again, and it will turn the lesion to improve your field of view. Small hematoma here. And after, you can do your incision from an injected area, and if it's not injected, you can inject again with the knife. But the main message is, don't try to do the injection in a non-injected area, please use the area which has already been injected to enlarge the injected area. Another point which is important is that when you are into the submucosa, it is quite effective to inject with the needle in, with the catheter itself. Why? Because if you inject with the catheter itself, the water will be injected front of you, in the area you just want to cut after. And therefore, your elevation will be very good. But if you inject with the needle out, you will inject not on the front of your submucosa you will cut in few minutes, but deeper. And therefore, the injection will be less effective for what you want to do, because the front of injection will be lower if you inject deeper than if you inject with the catheter itself front of you. And it is very effective to do it. You see here, needle in, we inject, the elevation is very good front of us, where we just want to cut, and not deeper at the tip of the needle. The needle usually are 4 millimeters, and what you want is to inject the submucosa front of you, not 4 millimeters. Next, the injection should be anticipated by an architect endoscopist, and for me it is the most important, because thanks to the injection you can make a difficult lesion easier, but you can also make an easy case becoming very difficult, because the injection turn it to the opposite way of your easy position. What you want to reach is something which is facing you with a mountain face, because if you are at the top of the mountain on the plate, you have a tangential approach, and the knife cannot enter into the submucosa very easily. But if you are facing the mountain face, the mountain elevation, you will be more effective with a deeper cut. And the worst is if you have a plate with a kind of hole at the top of the plate, because you are not tangential but going into a hole, and the angle is very difficult to fight against to reach the submucosal space. So what you want to create is a mucosal cushion with an elevation that face the cap, that face the scope, in order to just have to put your knife against the face of the mountain in order to enter deeply into the submucosa and cut the space into the submucosa relatively deeper. So what you want to reach is an angle between the knife and the mucosa you want cut of 90 degrees, I mean an opposition. If you have this 90 degrees, you will have more strength. You will have a direct and stable access, because your cap is on the mucosa, so it's stable, and the knife is entering the mucosa to cut it deeper. You will have a deeper incision, and therefore if you cut deeper, you will cut both the mucosa and the muscularis mucosa in the same time, and you will do simultaneously your trimming. It means the first ESD, the first dissection, that will open the space in the submucosa, making the scope able to enter into the submucosa. If you have a tangential approach of 120 degrees, you are tangential, so you are not really stable, because the scope is not on the mucosa but slightly moving on it, and the knife will not be really opposing the face of the mountain, not entering really the mucosa, but with this tangential approach you will not have a deeper cut. So your access is unstable, your incision is shallow, and the problem is that when you are shallow, you have a lot of small vessels that can bleed, and sometimes your incision is not continuously performed but discontinuously, and therefore you have to renew this incision by doing a complete incision, by passing a second time on the same area. you will see here the two triangles, the one when you have an approach which is a 90 degrees and the one when you have a tangential approach. And as you can see, you are beginning your ESD with a 90 degrees angle. Here you have done nothing except damaging the small vessels that are in the muscularis mucosa. So next thing, you should think about your injection. In blue, you have the cut line you have defined. I want to cut here, and I want to cut here, outside my dots. But if I inject on the red point, the elevation will be good on the dot, not before the dot. And therefore, where I want to cut, I am tangential, I have not a perpendicular approach. But if I inject a little more far, when I push, I will create a bubble which elevate facing me, and after I will be able to cut it like this. If I inject where I want to cut, here, the elevation will be here, but where I want to cut, I have not a good access. The better access is here. So you should think of it and do your injection a little far from your cutting line in order to make the mucosa growing front of you in order to have a deep incision with your knife. Injection outside the dots, cut on the face of the mountain, and the cut line should be elevated front of you. It means injecting outside your cut line. After, when you want to cut here, you have a tangential approach here. You have two possibilities. Here, you can see your dots, and where you want to inject is outside the dots, really. But after, you should remove the pressure in order to have a good elevation where you want. If you are pushing on this point, here I'm releasing the pressure in order to have a good elevation far from my dots, so the mucosa will face me where I want to cut. But last example, so from blue to blue, here I will get the elevation, it's okay. But in the last case, I will push without releasing the pressure. But if I release the pressure, it's okay. But if I push, I will have no injection where I'm pushing, because I'm fighting against the elevation by pushing on it. So what you want is to find the layer by pushing, and after to release the pressure in order to have a good elevation where you want to do. So please think of it, push to get the layer, and after remove your device in order to let the area elevate and not push it to reduce the filling by the fluid into this area. Next case, if you inject, you can create a better elevation if you do a movement like this with your knife, with your needle. You elevate the area you want to inject. We will see it on the movie. So you inject first. You have a small elevation if you inject front of you. But if now you inject and elevate the area, you turn with your scope, trying to elevate it, moving it, you will see. We will go close to it. You have created an elevation. You have more water into the cap, so it's more, its weight is increased, and then therefore the gravity will help you. And by doing this rotation with the needle, you increase your elevation exactly like you want, and therefore you open the space. Next case, if you have a difficult lesion, for example in the right colon, and the area is difficult to reach in the oral size, you will inject first at the oral side. I mean, if you want to create an elevation facing you for the distal point of the lesion, you will inject first far from the lesion, outside the dots, to create this mountain facing you. And therefore, after, you will cut it. Here, for example, it's a difficult lesion because the area you want to cut first is in the valley. It's not facing on the mountain, so it's very difficult case. But if you inject a lot outside the dots, you will create an elevation. You will make the lesion turning, and after, this area that was blind at the beginning will come to you, come to your visibility, and you will be able after to cut it front of you with an effective cutting line, because it's not a tangential approach but a perpendicular one. And you will see with the knife, thanks to it, you have this relatively perpendicular approach. You can re-inject with the knife to increase again this effect, and after, this area which was difficult to reach is now not totally tangential but perpendicular, and therefore incision is still a little difficult, but you manage to do it quite effectively. I mean, with a 90 degrees angle between your scope, your knife, and the mucosa. Second example, here we will inject first at the lower part, it's an esophagus. Here you have a tangential approach, so your incision is a little difficult, but if you inject a lot the lower part, the anal part here for this esophageal lesion, you will make the mountain facing you. Therefore, after, you have not a tangential approach like you have during your injection. You will have this mountain facing you, and therefore your knife will have a 90 degrees access to the mucosa to do your incision line more effectively. In some cases, when the area is very difficult to reach, for example in angles, sometimes you cannot go to an area with the scope itself. It's impossible, but by injecting it, you can reduce the distance between the scope and the area, and at this time you will be able to make the area coming to you. It's not you that goes to the mucosa, but thanks to the injection, the mucosa will come to you, and you will be able to cut it. You will need traction after to reach this area thanks to the traction, but at least at the beginning, to perform your incision, it is a recurrence in this case, we can see the whitish mucosa, but here it was very difficult to reach this area, but thanks to the injection, which is really important in volume, the mucosa is coming to the cap, and then you will be able to cut, because this mucosa has been reached because she went to you and not because the scope went to the mucosa. Last thing, your injection should be adapted to the strategy. It means that if you have decided to do first your oral injection, you inject first the oral side, and then you cut it, you do your cut line. After, you will do your anal injection, increase it, cut it, and therefore you will be able to put your traction on it in order to complete your incision and then tract it to the opposite to achieve the resection by doing only the dissection. Practically now, what are needed to perform your injection properly. First, you need a needle, and it is difficult to find a very good needle to do your procedure. You have to choose a compromise between the injection flow obtained with a large needle and a good penetrating needle that enters into the mucosa without needing to push a lot. So you want to find something which is relatively sharp to enter the tissue, relatively small to do a small hole, but relatively large to bring a lot of liquid into the submucosa in a small amount of time. And our compromise is a 4mm 25 gauge needle with a good tissue penetrability. And what is very important for us is that your needle is able to exit everywhere, even if you are retroflex with an important torsion into the scope. And for this, the best needles are the one with a metallic distal gain into the plastic catheter, because this gain, this metallic part, will orientate the needle, and therefore it will exit in any position. Before, with the plastic catheter only, sometimes the needle could exit outside the catheter and sometimes damage the scope, but with the metallic part, it goes and it opens in any position. So for us, it is important to have a good needle, the one what is perfect for you in terms of flow, but penetrability and openability in any position. And for us, the metallic distal sheet is very important. After, the ESD knife now should have a water jet. I think it's very important. With a low pressure, like dual knife jet, gold knife, flush knife, splash knife, we are more used to the dual knife, which has a very low rate of occlusion because the injection comes from the deeper part of the ceramic, and there is a flow which is not linear, which makes the clots moving. So the rate of obstruction of the water jet function is very, very low with this knife. So for us, it's one of the very good knives, but almost all the brands now propose a knife with a water jet function, like the gold knife, the flush knife, the splash knife, the dual knife jet. And you have also knives with high pressure, like the hybrid knife, which is a high pressure injection. And in some areas, like here in the stomach, it is possible to do the first injection from the beginning with the knife itself by doing a small hole through the mucosa. And when you reach the submucosa, you can inject from your first injection, but probably it is feasible in the stomach, not risky, but in the colon, very dangerous to do the first injection directly by a hole through the mucosa. You can damage the muscle during your first injection. So here you have the dual knife jet with the small hole of injection close to the needle, and to do a proper injection with the knife, it is better to do a small hole before injecting, because you will do a kind of isolation of the tip of the knife in the submucosa that makes the injection more effective. If you inject without doing a small hole, you will splash liquid everywhere. But if you do first a small hole, you will bring the water jet function close to the submucosa and avoid the liquid projection everywhere. So if you inject here, you will put a lot of water everywhere. If you do first an incision, go into the tissue and then inject, you will reduce the number of projection. Here you have a lot of water coming everywhere, and here, if you do a small hole before, the water is going into the submucosa, but very few outside in your field of view. Second point, the injection fluids. So what we want is a kind of ideal solution, a long-lasting one, but not too long if you have done a bad injection. So it should be stable and viscous, but not sticky on the lens, no bubbles, and enough liquid to be injected smoothly through a needle. If it's too viscous, it is very difficult for the nurse to inject properly. You should have a good electric conductivity, solutions with electrolytes, and it should respect the tissue and the scarring process for pathology evaluation and for scarring of the area. If possible, not expensive and available. Many studies have been done on the different solutions that are available on the market to compare the relative viscosity of the different products. The viscosity of the saline is considered 1, glycerol mix, for example, 3.4, Voluven 4.6, poloxamer mix 12.4, and hyaluronic acid 45. But in fact, the duration of the elevation is totally different between saline and Voluven, for example, with at 30 minutes nothing, but at 30 minutes you have still an elevation with hydroxyethyl starch. But with hyaluronic acid, the elevation is possibly a little higher, but in fact at 30 minutes the effect is the same. So if you are able to do your incision all around the lesion in less than 30 minutes, in fact, using hydroxyethyl starch or hyaluronic acid will give you the same comfort, I mean a good elevation that stays in time during your whole incision. The lifting here is less than 10 minutes with a very low lifting. After hydroxyethyl starch, you have a lifting after 30 minutes and a higher one. And after hyaluronic acid, you will have the same thing. What about the market? So glycerol mix is available in some pharmacies, like in our hospital. They produce it. The Voluven, which is hydroxyethyl starch, will probably be forbidden in the future for renal effects. The cellulose from Everlift from Duomed is made of cellulose. The Boston Arise had an unknown composition, and the Ovesco lift up was a poloxamer mix. The price are here, 61 euros for the cellulose, 40 euros for the lift up, and for the Boston Arise, because of problems of scarring with a kind of eye reaction with hyperplastic areas on the size on the area of the resection, it will have been removed from the market. So all these products, have probably a benefit, but is it cost effective? We don't know exactly. And finally, some examples of injection for some of our resection. So here we are too far to enter into the layer. So try to be more close, more perpendicular. Try to catch the area with the cap in order to reach. And then try to puncture and remove the pressure in order to get the good layer injection. And after, you go at the side of your bubble to enlarge the area which is injected. So once again, beginning in the blue to increase the blue area is more effective than doing new injection in a normal mucosa with no previous elevation. You will save time by doing your injection jumping from one area to the other. Second case, it is a lesion where the more difficult part is the oral part, not so easy to reach with the scope. And here we have injected. We should go a little far, but by increasing the injection area and putting a lot of liquid into the area, you will see we will make the lesion come to the scope and have a perpendicular approach of the mucosa facing your cap and facing your device, so your incision will be more effective because with a 90 degrees angle between the knife and the area which has been injected that comes to your cap. You see it? The better point is probably when you inject so much that the mucosa comes to your cap. So at this point, you don't have to move. The mucosa is coming to you instead of you going to the mucosa in the difficult area. So in conclusion, your injection should be precisely submucosal, should be designed to facilitate the procedure by injecting the difficult area to make it comes to you. You have to define your strategy from the beginning and then think of your injection to help your strategy. You should choose devices that are effective, precise, and responding to what you want. If you want to have a big flow, you should have a large needle. If you want to be very precise but you don't care of time, a smaller one will be easier to insert into the mucosa. The injection fluid should be effective but if possible cheap. And for example, glycerol mix or hydroxyethyl starch are very good candidates. If you have at the beginning of your experience, you could have benefits of using more viscous gels, like for example poloxamer or hyaluronic acid, in order to make your incision with a longer duration of lifting. Last thing is, let's go by yourself, experience the different case and try to change to obtain the better injection to help you for the next steps of the procedure. And the next step is incision. We will discuss about it in the next episodes. Thank you very much. We hope that this first podcast was helpful for you, and we will be pleased to present you the next one in order to share all our tips and tricks to master ESD. And you will see traction will be very important in what we will try to share with you. Thank you very much and see you soon.